Hey everyone, tonight we're starting with something a little darker. An age of plagues, punishments, and stews. Not the medieval fairy tale you've seen in the movies. No chivalrous knights, no parties under chandeliers. Forget the castles and chivalry that Hollywood has sold you. The truth is, you probably won't last a day. Before you settle in and get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fun to see who's taking part in this medieval invasion from around the world. Now go ahead, dim the lights. Now, turn the lights down. Maybe turn on the fan for a gentle hum. And let's get started tonight. Congratulations, you're waking up in 1325. The good news is you're still alive. The bad news is so are the fleas. And they're off to a good start. Your mattress, if you can call it that, is a half-rotten straw sack stuffed with hay, insects, and whatever else lived in the barn before you moved it in. It smells like a barn floor because it used to be a barn floor 3 months ago. No memory foam, no pillows, and certainly no Egyptian cotton sheets. Just a wool blanket that hasn't been washed since last winter, and now weighs almost as much as a small cow due to the accumulated dirt. You blink awake as church bells ring in the distance. It's a medieval version of an alarm clock, but louder and even kinder. Your home is a one-room wooden hut with no windows and a charming open floor plan, where your family, your livestock, and your house insects all share the same space. And forget about privacy. No bedrooms, no curtains, no personal space. Just you, 8 other people, 2 goats, and the smell. Oh, it's a symphony of smells. A delicate blend of old beer, human sweat, goat sweat, and something that you pray isn't mold, but in your soul probably isn't. Scented candles hadn't been invented yet, and even if they did, they would melt on your dirt floor. You try to stretch, but immediately regret it as the air is freezing and your joints ache. Welcome to your morning. Things will only get worse from here. In the 14th century, going to the bathroom was an adventure, a social experiment, and often a small public event. Let's talk about a medieval bathroom. If you were a peasant, there was no toilet, no seat, no toilet paper, no flush button, not even an enema in the corner. Just you, a full bladder, and a wooden bucket that smelled of failure. If you were lucky, there was a wooden bucket in the back, a smell that made you question your life choices. If not, it was full, because someone had a bad night after eating an unknown turnip. You took a deep breath, did your business, and then came the grand finale. Throwing it down the street. Yes, the street. But don't worry, there was a ritual of sorts. You had to shout "Garde-à-lou" before throwing your own personal horror out the window. It's an old French adage that means, look down. Though let's be honest, no one ever looks up in time. And the streets themselves? Imagine a charming little river, except it's not water. It's a bubbling mixture of human waste, animal excrement, and mysterious liquids that you absolutely do not want to investigate. These sewers are just a part of city life. It's not disgusting, it's tradition. And if you happen to live in a town posh enough to have public toilets, congratulations. You'll be sitting shoulder to shoulder with strangers in a wooden shed with no privacy and no air circulation like a dungeon. Conversation is allowed, but no eye contact. And toilet paper? It's great. Most people use straw, moss, leaves, old rags, or, if they're feeling extravagant, a piece of wool. And sometimes, brace yourself, they didn't use anything at all. That explains a lot of why handshakes take a while to get going. Even the nobility wasn't immune. If you lived in a castle, you'd have a garderobe, you might have a protective cloak, a hole in the wall that dropped your waist directly into the moat. Great, except your enemies knew about it until they found out and started crawling in the way your dinner crawled out. So whether you were a peasant or a baron, going to the bathroom in the Middle Ages was a humiliating ritual. It was cold, public, dangerous, and never not disgusting. Slip on a wet cobblestone and you'd fall face first into the remains of humanity. And you still hadn't brushed your teeth, but we'll get to that later. You survived the toilet. You deserve a reward, right? Maybe a good breakfast. Something warm, comforting. Sorry, this is medieval Europe. Nothing comforting and not exactly desirable here. No eggs Benedict, no crackling coffee maker, and certainly no buttered toast. Instead, welcome to your daily soup ration. You sit, or maybe squat, near a smoldering hearth, holding a wooden bowl of what looks like it was scraped from a muddy boot. This is your breakfast. It's thick, gray, slightly warm, and as cheerful as a tax audit in the rain. Pottage, the brainchild of survival cuisine and low expectations, is made from whatever's around. Grains, vegetables, maybe a few lentils if the gods are smiling on your village. It's been cooking in the same pot all week, sometimes longer. New ingredients are added on top. It's less a recipe than an ongoing, never-ending edible experiment. On the side, you have bread. And by bread, we mean a mass of rye or barley so dense it can deflect arrows. It's not sliced, it's negotiated. Because flour is expensive, your bread might be stuffed with sawdust, ground chestnuts, or even clay. Cutting it requires strategy. Chewing it might require divine intervention. And what about drinks? You're not sipping orange juice or oat milk lattes. You're drinking beer. Yes, beer. At 6 a.m. Why? Because water is full of parasites and filth. So you start your day with light, low-alcohol, survivable beer. Kids drink it too. No one's happy about it, but at least it won't kill you right away. Want meat or cheese? Dream on. That's for Sundays and holy days, and only if your God is feeling generous. As for meat, most peasants didn't eat meat more than a few times a year. As for fresh fruit, only when it was in season and hadn't fermented into wine. And don't even think about spices unless you were royalty. A pinch of pepper cost more than your monthly salary. Salt was valuable enough to be stored away, so you munched on coarse bread, drank medieval beer, and tried not to think about the mouse that might have nibbled your porridge at night. Breakfast doesn't give you energy. It just happens to you. And now that you've eaten poorly, it's time to work like your life depended on it, because it does. So you've finished your boring medieval breakfast, and now it's time to get dressed. Not that it helps. Your wardrobe has exactly one outfit. One. It's a rough sweater or linen shirt that you've worn every day for months, maybe years. There's no such thing as seasonal fashion. Just wear it until it falls apart or gives you a yeast infection. Underwear optional. If you're lucky, you might even wear a linen shirt underneath. Your wardrobe contains exactly one outfit. One. It's a coarse wool or linen shirt that you've worn every day for months, maybe years. There's no such thing as seasonal fashion. Not for special occasions, just one. Just wear it until it falls apart or gives you a fungal infection. A wool tunic coarse as a sack of thistles. If you're lucky, you might wear a linen dress underneath. But underwear? That's a luxury reserved for royal fantasies and paintings. Otherwise, you're stuck with thick, rough, sweat-wicking wool, all sewn haphazardly by someone who's never seen a decent seam in their life. And of course, there's no washing machine, no soap, and certainly no laundry service around. The result: your clothes are as stiff as sandpaper and smell like a forgotten pigsty pit. Even if you did manage to wash, it was an arduous process. You had to haul water from the river, boil it over a wood stove, and scrub your clothes with ashes or lye. Drying? Only in the sun, and unfortunately, the sun came out as often as your God had to pay in taxes. And shoes? If you owned a pair, they were made of raw leather, poorly sewn, and supported your feet like standing on a banana peel. Most peasants went barefoot, through mud, dung, sharp rocks, and whatever surprises nature had left for you overnight. And then, the roommates, fleas, lice, bedbugs, they didn't pay rent. They didn't leave. You scratched yourself constantly, sometimes with a stick, sometimes with a spoon. Even while discussing theology with the village priest. No one cared. It was just fashion, the medieval version. Itchy, dirty, and always crawling. Your skin is scratched from the friction. Your scalp is a battleground for lice and rashes. If you get a rash, no big deal. You just have to live with it for the next half year. There's no medicine, no diagnosis, no one to complain to. You just keep itching and suffering. And if you don't get an infection, congratulations, you've just gained an uninvited companion. Now you're dressed up and that damn feeling follows your every step. It's time to hit the fields. Time to work yourself to sleep, with your clothes itching like fire and your wool damp as spring sweat. It's time to smile. Or at least try. But you don't. Because in 14th century Europe, smiling wasn't a sign of happiness. It was a warning. Not about emotions. It was about teeth. There were no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, no floss, no mouthwash. Oral hygiene existed as a luxury that no one had ever experienced. Some chewed twigs. Some rinsed their mouths with wine, or if they were feeling adventurous, vinegar. But for the most part, your teeth were neglected and they weren't happy about it. By the time you turned 25, your smile looked like it had been dug out of a cursed tomb. Teeth were rotten, broken, and falling out like deserters. Gums were swollen like fermented grapes. And your breath? Almost like a biological weapon. Sugar was expensive only for the nobility. But that didn't stop them. They just decayed faster. And you, the hard-working peasant gnawing on stone bread, eating gritty porridge, chewing all your life, your teeth won't fall out quickly, but they will fall out for sure. Toothache? You'll pray or pry it out with a hook. And yes, your dentist is also a barber. No anesthesia. No sterilization. Just you, the pliers, and a scream. Infection? Hope you like fever. Because if not, you'll soon fall into delirium and die of toothache. And kissing? Go ahead if you're brave enough. But know that here, smiling is a battlefield and you're losing the battle. Get out there because your real job, the one that makes your back ache, isn't the worst part. Because now you're going to work. There's no office, no desk, no coffee breaks, and certainly no pay or benefits. If you're like 90% of the population, congratulations, you're a farmer. That means you spend your life plowing land that doesn't belong to you but to a lord you've never met who would probably get your name wrong if he did. You rise with the sun and only stop when it disappears behind the trees. Your tools? A wooden hoe, a rusty sickle, and every bone in your body that's still working. There's no weekend. There's no concept of getting off work. Just sunrise, sunset, and 6 days a week. Sunday? Maybe off. Unless you're rushing the harvest, chasing off bandits, or praying your swollen toes don't turn black. You plow the land by hand or by oxen if you're rich enough to own one. You dig, sow, pull, carry, repeat, until your back is bent like an S. Tired? No one cares. Emotional? Save it for after the harvest. If you're a woman, you don't just work in the fields. You raise children, spin, cook, clean, feed animals, and pretend not to see your husband's lice crawling onto your pillow. Children? They go to work at age 5. No school, no toys, just a wooden rake and the hope of surviving the winter. If you're a blacksmith, tanner, or cooper, congratulations. You still breathe in fumes, get chemicals, and work with animal entrails in a stuffy workshop. Fever? Drink some beer and get back to work. Because if you don't, someone will replace you tomorrow morning. It starts with winter. No insulation. No central heating. No concept of weathering. Just thin, gaping wooden walls that, if you tried, could fit a chicken through. Windows? No glass. Just a piece of smelly cloth hanging down, no heat, no wind, no snow. You have a fireplace at least in name. But you don't have enough wood to keep it burning all night. Wood is expensive. And if you think about going into the woods to pick up some sticks, be careful. Picking the wrong branch from the wrong forest can get you executed. That's right. For a branch. You wrap yourself in a damp sweater, huddle around a pile of embers, and still wake up with a frozen nose. Your feet are cold, always clammy, and your fingers are as stiff as little popsicle sticks. No one knows what frostbite is. They just call it bad luck. Fast forward to summer. Sounds easier? No. Your house is now a hot clay oven. No fans. No vents. No deodorizer. You sweat like a leaky well through layers of wool that can't be removed because showing skin is embarrassing, not to mention sunburn, mosquito bites, and judgmental neighbors. Flies swarm over your unwashed body odor and the fermented goat stew left in the corner. Mosquitoes buzz all night, assuming you sleep through the screaming neighbors and crying babies. In the fields, the sun bakes you. No sunscreen, no hat, unless you weave one out of straw like a desperate scarecrow. And the only thing that never changes, your clothes still itch, the food still sucks, and your job still waits. Welcome to medieval air conditioning, none of it. Thirsty? Refreshed? Just a sip, something cool to wash away the sweat that has been building since morning? Too bad. Because in the Middle Ages, water was not your friend. It was waiting to send you to God, sip by sip. The nearby stream might look fresh, clear, gurgling like a scene from a fairy tale. But that's a movie. This is reality. At its source, someone has just poured a chamber pot straight into it. If not, then there's a bloated, floating pig. And you're gulping down an army of bacteria. So, yes, beer. Even kids drank it. But before you imagine medieval children lining up to drink it like a carnival, know that it's a pale, low-alcohol beer made for survival. The brewing process boils the water, which kills at least some of the bacteria. And wine? Yes, if you were rich. And if you didn't mind drinking before sunrise. And bathing? In theory, fine. but it was believed to open your pores and invite disease. Public baths existed, then became hotbeds of gossip and debauchery and were outlawed by the church. And bathing at home? You had to carry water, light a fire, pour it into a leaky wooden tub, and hope no one used it before you, or worse, after you. And if you used rainwater? Welcome, bird droppings, insect eggs, moss. In short, in the Middle Ages, water wasn't life, it was a gamble. One wrong sip and you'd spend the rest of your days sweating on a straw bed, clutching your stomach, and pondering your life choices. The next time you take a sip of tap water, raise a glass to our ancestors. They didn't have the luxury of providing water without danger, so you drank it. Or maybe you didn't. Maybe you just stubbed your toe on a rock shaped like despair. Either way, you're sick. You need help. You need a doctor. Unfortunately, you live in the Middle Ages, where medical care meant being politely tortured by someone with a degree in theology. Let's start with the diagnosis. Everything that's wrong with your body, coughs, fevers, rashes, broken bones, even the plague, is attributed to humoral imbalance. The four sacred humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Your body is a soup, and the problem is that you've seasoned it wrong. Fever? Too much blood. The cure? Bloodletting. Draining the life out of you with a dull knife or a hungry leech. And yes, the person doing it can be a barber. 2 in 1, hairstyling and blood-sucking. Feeling sad or anxious? It must be excess black bile. Take a laxative. Or if you don't have one, pray and apply ice while your family starts hammering nails into your coffin, just in case. If you have a broken bone or a serious wound, good luck. No anesthesia. Surgery was performed with instruments that had not been washed since the Crusades. Red hot, not to disinfect, but to scare you out of your wits. Germs were unknown. Disease was believed to come from bad air, or that God was punishing you for thinking the wrong thing while you were half asleep. If you survived, it was God's mercy. The doctor got credit, and the leech? It got a promotion. In the Middle Ages, healing wasn't about living, it was about not dying. After a day of mud, lice, and a nagging backache, you finally get home, ready for the only thing that can be considered a reward, a warm dinner. The bad news: that meal may be secretly trying to kill you. Medieval food was not preserved, there was no way. No refrigeration, no freezing, just salt, smoke, or the faint hope that the winter was cold enough to keep the food from spoiling. The meat you got, if you were really lucky, had been hung upside down for days, fed flies, marinated in suspiciously dark brine, and probably had rats gnawing on one side. Bread, a seemingly basic, safe food, was also a gamble. In years of poor harvests, farmers would stuff it with bark, sawdust, even clay to thicken it. If you weren't careful, you'd end up eating an ergot fungus, which caused hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Eating a slice of bread could be like chewing LSD mixed with tetanus. Vegetables? Only when in season. But what was always available were turnips. Tons of them. Boiled, mashed, floating in a stew that, as you remember from Chapter 3, was basically a boiling mud pit from your great-grandfather's funeral. Fruit was perishable, sugar was as expensive as gold and only used to show off the rotten teeth of the aristocracy. Milk was a gamble. Yogurt would take a few hours and cheese was both delicious and full of bacteria. But you ate it anyway because the only other option was chewing on old shoe leather. Spices? Dream on. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg were worth as much as gold. Peasants had onions, salt, if they were lucky, and pain. Food wasn't meant to nourish you. It was a test of courage. Every bite was a gamble with fate. But you ate it anyway, because if you didn't, you'd have nothing to last you into the evening. You may think your day is going smoothly, but beware, God is watching. So is the priest. And don't forget your neighbor Agnes, who will denounce you if you dare miss Sunday morning mass. In medieval Europe, religion wasn't just a part of life. It was life. The church controlled your schedule, your laws, your education, if you were lucky enough to know how to read, the day you were born, the day you were married, the day you died, and everything in between. Think of the church as your spiritual landlord. And you always owe the rent. Your days revolve around the church bells, morning, noon, and night, not to mark the time, but to remind you that not praying is a sin. Skipping prayer? Sin. Eating meat on Friday? Sin. Dare to dream about your neighbor's wife? Double sin. And hell is no elusive concept. The priest describes it in vivid detail: lakes of boiling blood, rivers of fire, demons laughing, and eternal wailing. If you don't fear the plague, eternal damnation will. You can't read the Bible yourself, it's written in Latin and is only available to monks, priests, and a few noble children. You're completely dependent on the priest's sermon. If he says the crop failed because you were lazy to pray, you get down on your knees and pray twice as hard. Tithing a tenth of your harvest, your eggs, your chickens, everything you have, is your obligation. If you have nothing, congratulations, you've just gone bankrupt, both financially and spiritually. Holy days? Not for rest, but for going to church, fasting, confessing, and reminding yourself that joy is a dangerous luxury. Questioning the church? Heresy, burning. Practicing folklore? Witchcraft, drowning. Slip of the tongue? Blasphemy, flogging. Doubt? You will be reformed. So you follow the ritual. You kneel. You chant. You pray that after all this poverty, cold, and dust, your soul will go to heaven, assuming the priest likes you. Because in the Middle Ages, God could be merciful, but the church could not. If you think being a peasant in the Middle Ages was hard, try living a day as a woman. All the misery, hunger, filth, fear, and hopelessness was there, plus childbirth without anesthesia, unconditional submission, and total social exclusion. Being a woman in the Middle Ages was like playing a survival game on hard mode with no healing items, no reset button. From the moment you were born, your life was set: marry young, bear children, serve your husband, and die of exhaustion. Unless you were born into a noble family and sent to a convent, you would never learn to read and write. Your intellectual development stopped as soon as you learned how to churn butter and sew. Betrothed at 12, pregnant at 14, not for love, but for land, cattle, and family alliances. Your opinion? Not necessarily. After marriage, you became your husband's property. You were responsible for bearing children, caring for everyone, keeping the fires burning, and absolutely no complaining. Because complaining could get you labeled a spoiled brat or worse, a witch. And that label often came with being drowned, burned alive, or flogged in public. Childbirth was a life or death gamble. There were no doctors, no anesthetics, no clean instruments. A minor complication could kill both mother and child. If you survived 10 pregnancies, that was amazing. But many didn't get a second chance. And after giving birth, there was no rest. You held your crying baby in a flea-infested hut, still cooking, washing, and working in the fields as if you had never experienced childbirth. If you were a widow, you were taken advantage of and easily dispossessed. If you were single, you were suspected. If you were smart and didn't bow your head, you were seen as a moral menace. And if you looked at someone too strangely on a rainy Tuesday, good luck with the witch trials. Even in the church, your role was limited. Nuns were bound by strict rules: don't speak without permission, don't go anywhere without permission. Your spiritual worth always less than a man's. In short, being a woman in the Middle Ages meant enduring, obeying, giving birth, and suffering in silence. It was best to smile while doing so. Because even in times of general misery, women were expected to be more subdued in their misery. After you've dealt with lice, hunger, injustice, and maybe a grumpy goat, what could be worse? Hello, violence. It doesn't knock. It barges in. It's loud, bloody, and perfectly acceptable by medieval standards. Let's be clear, the Middle Ages were not peaceful. Law consisted mostly of hoping the local lord didn't wake up in a bad mood. Violence was everywhere, in the house, in the street, at church, in the marketplace, and of course, on the battlefield. Steal bread? You could lose a hand. Get accused of lying? Your tongue could be pierced. Talk too much? Congratulations, you get a metal bridle that locks your mouth with an iron bar. And that's just the start. Now, if you're accused of a more serious crime, heresy, witchcraft, theft, you're given a chance to prove your innocence. By torture. Welcome to trial by ordeal. One version, you have to dip your hand in boiling water to pick up a stone. If it heals without infection after 3 days, you're innocent. If it doesn't, sorry, you're a sinner and lose your hand. Another version, you're thrown into a river. Sinking? Innocent but dead. Floating? Guilty and still punished. This is a medieval reality show. The prize is survival. The host hopes you lose. Executions are public events. Hangings, burnings, beheadings. Villagers bring snacks, children giggle. It's 14th century Netflix. In the home, men are encouraged to discipline their wives and children with fists. In the street, you can get punched for looking at a nobleman's saddle. And in war? It was always there. For honor, for religion, or simply out of boredom. Violence was not a failure of medieval society. It was society. Justice was random. Life was fragile. And your neighbor? Might beat you up for raising pigs too loudly. Keep your head down, tread lightly, and never trust anyone with a club. By this point, you've survived the lice, the leeches, the misery of not having enough laundry, and the imminent threat of public humiliation. But now comes the final chapter of most medieval lives, an early, unflashy, unromantic death. If you're still breathing after 40, congratulations. You're famous. Not in the fan sense, but in the statistical miracle sense. Most people are with God long before that. The average lifespan is between 30 and 40, and that's not because anyone miscalculated. Almost half of children die before they turn 5. Diarrhea, malaria, pneumonia, even just falling. No vaccines, no antibiotics, no hope. If you survive childhood, welcome to adulthood with a depleted battery. Work starts when you can crawl upright, and by 25, your spine creaks like a wooden door that hasn't been oiled in a long time. Women? A different game. Childbirth is a life and death lottery. No anesthetics, no doctors, no timely surgery. Just prayers, boiling water, and the hope that someone will hold your hand while you bleed out on the hay. Many women survive 10 childbirths. Many don't make it past 2. Men? They could die from a falling plow, an infected cut, or a drunken neighbor. Even a trip to the market could be a last trip if you meet the wrong robber or angry tax collector. Death could come from plague, famine, or simply eating grain laced with poisonous mushrooms and hallucinating to death screaming. A funeral? If you were lucky, you got one. No embalming, no shiny coffin, just a hole, a few mumbled words, and a mound of dirt. If there was room. Because in the Middle Ages, life was a gradual procession to death, surprising, random, and never kind. You didn't retire in the Middle Ages. You just disappeared. No party, no cake or coworker signing cards. One day you stopped showing up in the field and no one asked. The Middle Ages dream? It died the moment you opened your eyes and realized you'd just slept in moldy straw next to a chicken. You shit in a bucket, brushed your teeth with vinegar or nothing, ate stew that had been fermenting for the past week, worked until your back screamed, and then sat around praying that you didn't catch the plague or step on something that would kill you. Do you still want to be a knight? Think again. Everything you know about the Middle Ages, shining knights, blonde princesses in ivory towers, candlelit banquets, is the stuff of storybooks and Hollywood. Myth polished by fairy tales, not reality. Reality? Cold, dirty, dangerous, and devoid of everything that makes life worth living. Even the nobility did not live like stories. They might have fur cloaks and wine goblets, but they also had castles as drafty as ice boxes, loveless marriages, and the chance of dying from an infection from a splinter in the hand. A bowl of bad soup could send you to the graveyard faster than a prayer. Class did not protect you from misery, it just changed how you experienced it. Everything was harder. Everything hurt more. From chewing to sleeping, from loving to dying, every aspect was a drawn-out struggle. And if there was a moment to dream, forget it. You could not turn on life. There was no internet, no doctors, no opportunities. Where you were born, there you died within a 10-mile radius of your first manger. And yet, people loved, sang, dreamed. Not because life was easy, but because it was human nature. They found light, however small, even in the darkest chapters of history. So tonight, as you slide into your clean bed, in your warm room, next to your flushing toilet, perhaps give a silent thanks to the modern world and to the ancestors who fought rats, famine, and feudalism so you wouldn't have to. Long before she was Catherine the Great, Empress of all Russia, patron of enlightenment, architect of empire, she was simply Sophie. A bright girl with a long name and longer odds. She was born in 1729 in the Baltic town of Stettin with a name longer than most maps, Sophie Friederich August von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornberg. Her bloodline was technically noble, but no one in Europe was watching her house. They had titles, yes, but titles without land were just decorative labels. She came from a family that could get into a ballroom but not onto a battlefield. Her mother, Johanna Elizabeth, had ambition carved into every gesture. She didn't believe in fate, she believed in leverage. Sophie wasn't raised, she was positioned. From a young age, her future was mapped not in milestones but in marriage proposals. Johanna didn't look for warmth, she looked for opportunity. Her father, Christian August, wore a Prussian uniform and spoke like an order. He wasn't cruel, just unreachable. He treated parenting like a military inspection, brief, formal, and mostly symbolic. So Sophie learned the rules of survival early: speak when needed, observe always. She memorized how power moved in a room. She listened more than she spoke. When others played, she watched. She stored details the way others stored heirlooms. Her education was thorough: languages, literature, history. She devoured Voltaire before most girls in her class had stopped reading fairy tales. French, German, a little Latin. She learned the logic of men who ruled countries while knowing full well no one expected her to rule anything. She was fluent in etiquette and invisible ambition. When adults spoke, she cataloged their weaknesses. When courtiers flirted, she counted which ones mattered. She wasn't interested in dresses or dances. She was interested in control. At 13, she understood silence as a strategy. She knew how to nod without agreeing, how to flatter without revealing opinion. Every conversation was a transaction. Every smile, a tool. Charm was useful. So was restraint. Then came the letter. Russia was looking. Not for power, but for appearance. A bride for the heir to the throne, someone foreign enough to be grateful, obedient enough to stay quiet. Sophie was recommended. She didn't protest. She packed. The journey to Russia was long. The snow was unfamiliar, the language worse. She arrived in St. Petersburg in 1744 with 2 thin gloves and a rehearsed smile. Her mother walked beside her with purpose. Sophie followed quietly, calculating. No one there knew the extent of her memory. Soon she would be given a new name, a new religion, and a new role. None of it would feel foreign. She had already shed versions of herself before. Identity was negotiable. Intention was not. No one in the Russian court saw her coming. They assumed they were importing a decorative wife. But she had read enough to know that royal wives were often underestimated. And underestimated people had room to maneuver. What began in the drawing rooms of a small German duchy would not stay there. Because Sophie had studied more than books. She had studied power. She didn't need a prophecy. She just needed time. She left Germany with a new dress, a mother's ambition, and the unspoken certainty that this was not a marriage, it was an audition. In 1744, 14-year-old Sophie von Anhalt-Zerbst was summoned across half of Europe to meet her future. The Russian Empress, Elizabeth Petrovna, was seeking a bride for her nephew and heir, Grand Duke Peter. What she wanted was someone manageable, loyal, grateful, unlikely to cause waves. Sophie fit the profile: minor nobility, Lutheran background, German like Peter, and young enough to mold. From the outside, this looked like a diplomatic arrangement. But Sophie understood it for what it was, her one narrow path into power. She arrived in St. Petersburg wearing a thin German cloak and a trained diplomatic smile. Her mother walked beside her with pride. Sophie walked with purpose. If she passed this test, the future could open. If not, she would disappear into a list of forgotten alliances. Once in Russia, she did what was required efficiently without complaint. She converted from Lutheranism to Russian Orthodoxy. Her name became Ekaterina Alexievna, later Catherine. The transformation was symbolic, theatrical, and irreversible. The new faith, the new name, the new language, it was not assimilation. It was a calculated severing. She was burning her birth certificate in real time. The court applauded. They thought they had imported a docile, grateful wife in training. Someone who would stay quiet and smile on command. What they got was a strategist in waiting. The marriage to Peter began, technically but not emotionally. He was awkward, volatile, and uninterested in governing or his wife. He idolized Frederick of Prussia and disdained everything Russian, including Catherine. He mocked the Orthodox Church, insulted the nobility, and reportedly avoided consummating the marriage for years. He preferred playing with toy soldiers. Catherine, meanwhile, was studying the battlefield that actually mattered. While Peter ridiculed their surroundings, Catherine made herself Russian, more Russian than many born within its borders. She immersed herself in the language, memorized Orthodox rituals, absorbed the history, and noted the power structures. She learned not just how the court functioned, but how it fractured. Isolated by her husband, manipulated by her mother, and monitored by every pair of eyes in the palace, Catherine did not panic. She did not rebel. She watched. She learned. Every cold shoulder taught her something. Every dismissal confirmed what she already suspected: no one would build a future for her. So she would have to construct it herself. She took no allies at face value and no insult without calculation. She studied court etiquette, but also court silence: who wasn't speaking, who wasn't being spoken to. She understood early that in Russia, loyalty could shift in a day, and survival favored those who prepared while others plotted. And while Peter paraded his immaturity, Catherine was gathering knowledge like weapons. By the time their marriage had fully disintegrated into formality, she already had a plan. Not for rebellion, for endurance. Because to her, the Russian court wasn't a cage. It was scaffolding. And she was building something far taller than a throne. She wasn't holding power. Not yet. But she was learning how power holds itself and who's allowed to touch it without bleeding. If the Russian court had a national sport, it was betrayal. Whispers were currency. Favor was lethal. And Catherine, still technically a foreign teenage wife with no real standing, had just been dropped into the middle of its most dangerous arena. Her marriage was ornamental. Her title was conditional. And every eye in the palace watched her like a loaded question waiting for the wrong answer. This wasn't about who you married or what you wore or how you curtsied. It was about who you spoke to after dinner. Who stood a little too close. Who didn't stand close enough. The court of Empress Elizabeth was a glittering trap, polished to perfection and sharpened at the edges. Every maid could be a spy. Every priest might report. Every conversation had a listener, and Catherine quickly realized silence was the safest form of self-defense. She adapted, but not passively. While Peter, still obsessed with his toy soldiers and Prussian fantasies, alienated nearly every pillar of Russian tradition, Catherine made herself useful. Not loudly, not publicly, quietly. She began to cultivate allies, not by declarations, but by attention. A kind word here, a remembered name there. The gestures added up. Among the military, she won respect through dignity. Among scholars, she sparked interest with intellect. She didn't campaign. She connected. Slowly, deliberately, she built a private scaffolding of influence while maintaining the posture of decorum. Where Peter sneered, Catherine listened. Where he played, she planned. Behind closed doors, she read. Voltaire, Montesquieu, Enlightenment thinkers whose books were banned in some countries but studied in hers. She wasn't reading for leisure. She was assembling a new architecture of thought. What is sovereignty? What is justice? What makes a monarch legitimate? These weren't questions for academic curiosity. These were the blueprints of her future. Meanwhile, her reputation outside the bookshelves began to solidify. Catherine was graceful, polite, unthreatening on the surface. But the court started to notice something else. She didn't panic. Not when rumors swirled. Not when Peter embarrassed her. Not when alliances shifted. That calm wasn't ignorance. It was calculation. She began forming alliances with the guards, particularly the Orloff brothers, men who saw in her something more than royal decoration. She spoke to them not as a wife scorned, but as a strategist preparing the next move. Her circle widened. Tutors, priests, stewards, even foreign dignitaries. She didn't need a throne to act like a ruler. She just needed time. The brilliance of Catherine's strategy wasn't in how bold it was. It was in how invisible it remained until it didn't need to be. She never posed a threat until she became one. Every alliance, every nod, every book on her shelf was a quiet rehearsal for the day she would finally take the stage. The Russian court never saw her coming, but she had been walking toward the center all along. And soon, it wouldn't just be the court she outmaneuvered. It would be the crown. This is where everything pivots. The quiet girl becomes a tactician. The forgotten wife becomes the most powerful woman in 18th century Europe. The year is 1762. The game is now hers. Peter III had barely warmed the throne before he began unraveling it. Upon Empress Elizabeth's death, Peter, Catherine's estranged husband, ascended as Tsar of Russia. Took weeks, not years, for him to offend just about everyone who mattered. His open admiration for Frederick the Great of Prussia, Russia's sworn enemy, felt less like foreign policy and more like treason. He rolled back P. With the nobility, he fared no better. His childish behavior, obsession with toy soldiers, and outbursts of Prussian nationalism turned courtly respect into court-wide embarrassment. He insulted generals, alienated ministers, and made no effort to hide his disdain for Russian customs. Then came the final crack. He announced plans to divorce Catherine and marry his mistress, Elizaveta Vorontsova, a woman the court loathed and Catherine had learned to tolerate with terrifying calm. What Peter didn't realize was that while he was busy burning every bridge, Catherine had been quietly building her own. For 15 years, she had watched, waited, and networked. If Peter was a fuse, Catherine was the spark that knew exactly when to light it. While Peter vacationed at his summer palace, Catherine moved. She coordinated with the Orloff brothers, most notably Grigory Orloff, her trusted lover and a decorated military officer. Together, they activated a silent, precise coup. Key officers in the Imperial Guard were ready. Catherine appeared in full military uniform, not as a hostage of circumstance, but as a ruler by intent. She rode through the streets of St. Petersburg, calm, composed, flanked by soldiers. The church anointed her. The army saluted her. The people accepted her. Peter, abandoned and stunned, surrendered without a fight. Days later, he was reported dead. Official cause, a sudden and severe hemorrhoidal attack. Unofficially murdered, likely strangled on the orders of someone close to the Orloffs. Catherine didn't order it, but she didn't punish it either. Silence was her verdict. Stability was the sentence. Now crowned as Catherine II, Empress of Russia, she stood alone. No bloodline placed her here. No marriage kept her here. This wasn't an inheritance. It was an achievement. She hadn't taken the throne because it was offered. She took it because she calculated how to make it hers. Her coup wasn't just bloodless. It was surgical. The kind of political maneuver that makes later revolutions look noisy and clumsy. Russia didn't erupt. It exhaled. One ruler vanished. Another emerged. The empire simply shifted direction, as if history had always planned it that way. What followed was not relief, but challenge. Catherine had won the throne. But could she hold it? She was a foreigner, a woman, a usurper in the eyes of many. She understood the precarious balance. Power claimed by brilliance must be defended with brilliance. And from this moment on, she ruled with one hand on the scepter, and the other always hovering above the sword. This was the birth of the Empress, not by blood, not by marriage, but by force of will. Catherine didn't wait to be written into history. She broke in and rewrote the paragraph. And in doing so, she redefined what it meant to be chosen. This is the part where Catherine stops playing defense and starts constructing her. From the moment she claimed the crown, Catherine knew she had no birthright to lean on, no royal blood to justify her place. She needed something grander than lineage, so she chose an idea, the Enlightenment. Philosophy would be her armor. She began writing to Voltaire, Europe's brightest mind and sharpest tongue. Their letters stretched over 15. But Catherine was never just reading. She was translating thought into power. In 1767, she drafted the Nakaz, a sweeping legislative guide. On the surface, it was a manifesto for modern governance, advocating rule of law, opposing torture, limiting arbitrary executions, and insisting that rulers serve the people, not the other way around. For Russia, a land still clinging to medieval habits, it was nothing short of revolutionary. For Europe, it was confirmation. The German usurper was now the most progressive monarch in the East. Education followed. Schools were opened, including rare institutions for girls. Textbooks were standardized. Teachers were trained. In an era where most rulers feared books more than swords, Catherine distributed both. When smallpox ravaged Europe, she took a personal risk: public vaccination. She became the first monarch in Europe to do so, not only surviving the procedure but promoting it as an act of civic courage. Russia watched, and Russia followed. But not all systems were so easily reformed. For all her rhetoric of progress, Catherine refused to abolish serfdom. It wasn't ideology, it was arithmetic. The nobility held the empire together, and serfs were the bricks. To stay in power, she needed the support of those who had helped her take it. So she expanded noble privileges. More land, more control over peasants, fewer taxes, greater legal immunity. Enlightenment for some, reinforced chains for others. Her critics called it hypocrisy. She called it necessary. Voltaire didn't press too hard. Perhaps even he understood that dreams die quickly without allies. This wasn't cowardice. It was calibration. Catherine didn't believe in toppling the table. She believed in rearranging the pieces until the board tilted her way. Her reforms made headlines. Her compromises made history. She ruled like a philosopher, but never forgot she was also a survivor. Beneath the talk of liberty, she knew her empire was a powder keg of tradition, pride, and inequality. So she walked the tightrope, one foot in Parisian salons, the other in feudal backyards. She wasn't just modernizing Russia, she was branding it, a woman on the throne in a patriarchal empire, a foreigner dictating Russian law, a usurper daring to quote Montesquieu and rule like Augustus. The world didn't quite know what to make of her. That was fine. Catherine was writing the story herself. Enlightened in theory, ruthless in practice, Russia's future was being drawn not just on maps, but in letters, policies, and textbooks. And behind every new decree stood a woman who had read every argument, then decided which ones to implement and which to shelve for later. She wasn't just ruling Russia. She was rebuilding its reflection, one that looked progressive in the mirror, even if the foundation stayed unchanged beneath the floorboards. This is the part where Catherine stopped securing her crown and started redrawing the map of Europe. Power wasn't enough. The empire itself had to grow. From the moment she settled into power, Catherine understood that legitimacy was her first target, the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, Russia had been boxed in, landlocked. Two wars followed, 1768 to 1774 and 1787 to 1792. Under generals like Alexander Suvorov and the formidable Grigory Potemkin, Russian forces crushed Ottoman resistance. The spoils were massive: Crimea, swaths of the northern Black Sea coast, and the creation of Sevastopol, a naval city built from scratch, destined to become Russie. But war wasn't her only tool. Catherine wielded diplomacy like a scalpel. In the West, she turned to Poland not to conquer it, but to dismember it slowly. Alongside Austria and Prussia, she orchestrated the partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in three devastating stages: 1772, 1793, and 1795. By the end, Poland was gone from the map. Russia walked away with millions of new subjects and fertile lands: Belarus, parts of Ukraine, Lithuania. No siege, no invasion, just signatures, threats, and a talent for exploiting chaos. Catherine didn't just crush kingdoms with armies. She collapsed them on paper. But conquest means little without control. Catherine knew that taking land was easy, keeping it required architecture. So she built systems: new provinces, appointed governors loyal to the throne, implemented Western-style bureaucracies, and extended the Orthodox Church's reach. Forts were raised, schools opened, and whole regions Russified within a generation. And she didn't just govern these lands. She populated them. Entire communities of Germans, Poles, Greeks, and others were invited to settle in southern Russia. They were offered land, tax breaks, and the promise of prosperity. In return, they brought agriculture, trade, and permanence. Cities like Odessa, Kherson, and Ekaterinoslav weren't just settlements. They were imperial outposts in Catherine's southern vision. This wasn't opportunistic. It was orchestral. Military conquest played the overture. Diplomacy added harmony. Colonization and governance kept the rhythm. Catherine didn't just win wars. She converted victories into systems, and systems into permanence. By the end of her reign, Russia wasn't merely a northern empire. It was a continental giant. The numbers spoke for themselves. A territorial leap from 15 to over 20 million square kilometers. A strategic grip on the Black Sea, new influence in Central Europe, and a global posture on par with Britain, France, and Austria. Russia no longer looked inward. It stared down rivals across every frontier. Peter the Great opened a window to the west. Catherine tore down the wall and built a balcony. Her ambition wasn't subtle, and it wasn't apologetic. She expanded the empire not as a steward, but as its architect. This was the transformation. From a woman seizing power to one shaping destiny. The Enlightenment Empress became the imperial sovereign. And where her ink could not reach, her armies did. She didn't just expand borders. She expanded history itself. Before the Enlightenment crown and imperial ambition, there was something far more controversial: desire. Catherine's love life didn't shadow her rule. It illuminated its complexity. She was powerful, brilliant, relentless. And yes, she had lovers. Many. Often younger, often handsome, often politically useful. These relationships weren't private indulgences. They were strategic alliances crafted in silk sheets and candlelit parlors. Catherine didn't just rule with her mind. Sometimes she ruled through the heart, hers and theirs. Her lovers were chosen carefully. Charm, youth, and obedience were baseline. But loyalty and usefulness? Non-negotiable. Once in her orbit, a favorite could rise faster than any bureaucrat. Titles were granted. Estates were gifted. Honors fell like spring rain. And when their time ended, as it always did, they departed with dignity, pensions, and sometimes a palace. Catherine wasn't sentimental, but she wasn't cruel either. It wasn't romance. It was governance through intimacy. Among them all, one man stood apart: Grigory Potemkin. He was not just a lover, he was a co-ruler, a military genius, a visionary administrator. a man whose ambition matched hers stride for stride. Some say they secretly married. Others argue they didn't need to. The bond was already sovereign. While Catherine anchored the throne in St. Petersburg, Potemkin carved new provinces out of dust. Crimea, the Black Sea coast, cities like Odessa and Sevastopol, they weren't just strategic outposts. They were Potemkin's work, Catherine's will. Together, they didn't flirt with power. They built it. Some monarchs find advisors. Catherine found a partner in empire. But where there's power and autonomy, there's fear. And from fear comes rumor. Western Europe could not reconcile the woman who ruled like Peter and loved like Cleopatra. So they tried to reduce her. Pamphlets whispered about her appetite. Cartoons depicted her with lovers, then with animals. The infamous myth of the horse, fabricated after her death by enemies who couldn't bear the idea of a woman commanding history. It wasn't just misogyny. It was political warfare. Catherine's real crime, in their eyes, was not promiscuity. It was sovereignty. She didn't wait for a king to lend her authority. She was the authority, and that terrified them. While male rulers paraded mistresses without consequence, Catherine's private life became a referendum on her morality. But the scandal never stopped her. She didn't shrink. She ruled with one hand and rewrote expectations with the other. Her lovers didn't weaken her reign. They reinforced it. They served at court, led armies, governed provinces. And when they were gone, her rule remained unchanged. Because none of them were ever the source of her power. They were instruments. She was the composer. Catherine's reign was never just about land and law. It was also about challenging the architecture of gender and authority. She wore power unapologetically and refused to separate her womanhood from her rule. Her femininity wasn't a liability. It was another language through which she led. This chapter of her legacy, often reduced to whispers and innuendo, is in fact one of the most revealing. It shows a sovereign who understood every lever of influence, from law to love, and pulled each one with equal skill. Because for Catherine, politics wasn't confined to council chambers. It lived in conversation, in presence, in trust built over candlelight. And she mastered that arena as deftly as she mastered the battlefield. She ruled like a monarch. She loved like a woman, and she was judged for both. But history remembers results, and Catherine got them. Catherine's private life wasn't her weakness. It was part of her empire. Before it was the Enlightenment crown or imperial expansion, there was fire, and it came not from philosophers or diplomats, but from the boots of the desperate. In 1773, the Russian Empire faced not a foreign enemy, but a man with a beard, a lie, and a following. His name was Emelian Pugachev, a former Cossack soldier, grizzled by frontier wars, disillusioned by imperial betrayal. He claimed to be Peter III, Catherine's overthrown and allegedly murdered husband. "I survived," he declared, "and I've returned to take back my throne from the foreign usurper." For the desperate, it didn't matter if the story made sense. It offered something truth never had: hope. Pugachev's rebellion wasn't a sideshow. It was an eruption. Cossacks, peasants, serfs, religious dissenters, all those crushed under the weight of feudal Russia, flocked to him. He promised liberation from serfdom, land redistribution, religious freedom. His words traveled faster than any decree from St. Petersburg. And unlike Catherine's Enlightenment ideas, his promises sounded immediate. It started in the Volga region, but it spread like wildfire. Fortresses fell. Nobles were slaughtered. Feudal codes were torn down overnight. It wasn't just a revolt, it was a full-blown insurrection. For the first time in her reign, Catherine's throne didn't feel secure. Her vision of a rational empire was burning in real time. And behind it all, a man in a peasant's coat shouted, "Russia belongs to us." This wasn't just a peasant uprising. It was a crisis of legitimacy. Could a German-born empress who seized power by coup truly claim the heart of rural Russia? Could Enlightenment ideals reach beyond palace walls into villages where people still lived like it was the Middle Ages? Catherine didn't answer with speeches. She answered with steel. She dispatched General Suvorov, brilliant, brutal, efficient. The imperial army crushed Pugachev's forces with methodical precision. Villages were torched. Supporters were executed. The rebellion, once mythic in its momentum, collapsed. In 1775, Pugachev was captured, paraded in an iron cage through the streets of Moscow, then publicly beheaded, his blood washing away any illusions that the crown could be challenged without consequence. But Catherine didn't stop with the man. She extinguished the hope, too. Whatever remained of her ambitions to reform serfdom died with Pugachev. Before the rebellion, she had flirted with emancipation. After it, she hardened. The nobility received expanded powers. Serfs became more tightly bound to the land. Surveillance intensified. Civil organization in the countryside was dismantled. Freedom was no longer theoretical. It was subversive. Catherine, the self-styled philosopher queen, now ruled like a fortress. And the Enlightenment? It remained in her letters, not her legislation. Pugachev's rebellion didn't just test her authority. It rewired it. She learned that idealism didn't stabilize empires. Control did. She would continue to sponsor education, collect art, and correspond with Voltaire. But in her policies, she became something else. Not the liberator of the peasants, but the guardian of order. Because the fire had licked too close. She ruled with enlightenment in her heart, and fear in her hand. She ruled with ambition, expanded with brilliance, and left behind a legacy that dazzled, yet cracked beneath its own contradictions. Welcome to the final chapter of Catherine's reign. In her later years, Catherine wasn't just expanding borders or crushing rebellions. She was sculpting an identity for Russia and for herself. No longer the usurper in a borrowed crown, she now stood as a patron of culture, a builder of schools, a correspondent of Enlightenment icons. The Hermitage, founded in 1764, began as a private gallery. By the time of her death, it had become one of the greatest museums on earth. Inside its halls hung Rembrandts, Rubens, and Van Dycks, silent witnesses to her appetite for beauty and power. Catherine collected more than art. She collected respect from a Europe that once laughed at Russian backwardness. But she didn't stop at walls and canvases. She opened schools, many for noble girls, an idea nearly heretical in 18th century Europe. She commissioned printing presses, funded libraries, and translated the words of Voltaire and Montesquieu into Russian syllables. Through letters, she remained a peer among philosophers. Russia, she insisted, could think like Paris and still rule like an empire, but not all her foundations were made of marble. While Catherine crowned herself with the Enlightenment, she anchored her rule in serfdom. Millions remained chained to the land, owned by landlords whose loyalty she needed more than reform. After the Pugachev rebellion, she abandoned any lingering dreams of rural liberation. Her vision of progress never touched the villages. She built museums in the capital and silence in the countryside. And then there was Paul, her son, her heir, her problem. Catherine distrusted Paul with a queen's instinct and a mother's dread. She found him unstable, erratic, too quick to anger, too slow to think. She excluded him from statecraft, kept him at arm's length from power, and reportedly toyed with naming her grandson Alexander as successor. In the end, Catherine died before making that move. Paul became czar, but only briefly. His reign ended with a dagger and a coup. Catherine had built a throne no one she trusted could inherit. So what was the sum of it? She gave Russia culture. She gave it borders. She gave it modernity encased in gilded tradition. But she also gave it silence where voices should have risen, control where freedom once flirted, and a fragile future no longer shaped by her will. She ruled with vision, but died knowing vision alone cannot shape the future. She didn't fade into history. She left it burning behind her, reshaped, rewritten, and undeniably hers. This is how the reign of Catherine the Great ended. In November 1796, after 34 years of rule, Catherine collapsed suddenly from a stroke. She died shortly thereafter at the age of 67. No grand procession, no long goodbye. One moment she was running an empire, the next gone. Paul, her estranged son, took the throne she had denied him a role in for decades. And with his coronation, the court turned a sharp corner, reversing many of her policies. But while Paul wore the crown, everyone knew whose shadow still ruled the room. Her death may have ended her rule, but not her reign over Russian identity. She left behind more than an empire. She left a transformation. Territorially, Catherine expanded Russia by over 200,000 square miles. From Crimea to the Black Sea coastline, from Polish farmlands to fortified port cities, her campaigns turned a landlocked empire into a global naval player. Cities like Odessa and Sevastopol weren't just settlements, they were declarations. Under her rule, Russia wasn't merely present on the map. It redrew the map. Culturally, she pulled Russia out of the feudal fog and into the Enlightenment's glow. The Hermitage began as her private collection. It ended as one of the world's greatest museums. She built schools, libraries, and salons. She wrote plays. She edited laws. She corresponded with the greatest minds of the age, not as a student but as an equal. She turned the cold corridors of St. Petersburg into the new salons of Paris, proving that power and intellect could speak the same language. And then there was the image, the symbol. A woman who wasn't supposed to rule. A German outsider who took a Russian crown. A widowed consort who staged a bloodless coup. She became more than queen. She became an idea. That power didn't need to be inherited, it could be earned. That strength didn't need to shout, it could plan in silence. That leadership didn't need a king, it could stand alone. They called her the Great. Not because she was gentle, not because she was loved by all, but because she got results. She didn't govern by sentiment. She governed by strategy. She saw Russia not as it was, but as it could be, and she pulled it, kicking and screaming, toward that vision. In the process, she left behind a country richer, stronger, more modern, and more divided. Catherine did not leave a utopia. She left a contradiction. A mighty empire built on Enlightenment thought, still chained to feudal roots. A vision of reform haunted by control. A nation civilized in its cities, but combustible in its countryside. But one truth was clear. She had turned the impossible into precedent. In 1994, a quiet excavation in the jungles of Chiapas would unsettle centuries of silence and open a new CH. The setting was Temple 13, an unassuming pyramid nestled next to the grand temple of the inscriptions at the ancient city of Palenque, once the thriving capital of a powerful Maya kingdom. This site was already known as the burial place of Pacal the Great, one of the most influential rulers in Maya history. His ornate tomb, discovered decades earlier, had captivated the world. No one expected much from the smaller temple beside it, until something unexpected emerged. A team of Mexican archaeologists, led by Fanny Lopez Jimenez, was conducting a structural survey of Temple 13 when they encountered an anomaly. A sealed chamber beneath the stone. Unlooted, untouched, completely intact. The air inside had not moved in over 1,000 years. And at its center was a single stone S. When the heavy lid was opened, the room responded with a burst of red. A layer of cinnabar, powdered mercury sulfide, coated everything. The coffin, the walls, the bones inside. It hung in the air like ash, clung to the skin, and shimmered under light. Cinnabar was not decoration. In Maya funerary ritual, it was sacred, associated with blood, rebirth, and the passage to the underworld. But it was also toxic. Handling it too long, even inhaling it, could be fatal. That made its presence even more striking. Inside the sarcophagus lay the skeleton of a woman. Her remains were delicate, yet preserved. A funerary mask made of jade mosaic covered her face. Her body was adorned with jewelry, necklaces, earrings, a diadem, all crafted from jade and shell. Around her were ceremonial tools. Bone pins, obsidian blades, carved objects with faint but deliberate markings. Every detail suggested a burial of the highest status. And yet there was no name, no inscriptions on the tomb, no hieroglyphs on the chamber walls, no explicit record of who she was. That silence gave rise to a title, the Red Queen. She was not a myth. She was not invented. She was real. A woman entombed next to one of the most powerful kings of the Maya world, buried in full regalia, covered in cinnabar like a deity, and preserved in a tomb untouched by looters, time, or weather. Whoever she was, she had been buried with intention, reverence, and power. The location was deliberate. Temple 13 is just meters from Pakal's tomb, and in Maya spatial logic, proximity carried meaning. To be buried this close to a king required lineage, status, or a spiritual role equal to his. It was not symbolic. It was structural, ritual, precise. The discovery raised immediate questions. Was she his wife, his mother, a ruler in her own right? The absence of a name made her harder to place in history, but the placement of her body, surrounded by elite symbols, immersed in red, made her impossible to ignore. This was not a standard royal tomb. It was cleaner, sharper, intimate in scale but overwhelming in symbolism. And unlike Pakal's richly inscribed crypt, hers said nothing, at least not in words. The Red Queen was meant to be remembered differently, through pigment, through placement, through absence. The Red Queen's tomb remains one of the rare untouched burials of Mesoamerica. No theft, no desecration, just a sealed vault and a woman shrouded in ceremony. Whatever her true name, her presence speaks louder than many whose names were carved into stone. To understand the Red Queen, you must understand what covered her. A red dust, sacred and lethal, that speaks more than inscriptions ever could. Cinnabar, known to science as mercuric sulfide, a mineral with a deep crimson hue, ground into a fine powder and used in the ancient world for both beauty and death. In Mesoamerican cultures, especially among the Maya, cinnabar was not decoration. It was a sacred substance, mined with difficulty, refined with intent, and used sparingly. It was rare, costly, and reserved for rituals of great spiritual consequence. The Maya understood color not just visually, but cosmologically. Red, in their worldview, was more than pigment. It symbolized blood, the essence of life, lineage, sacrifice. It echoed the rising sun, the beginning of a journey, the first breath after death. To cover the dead in cinnabar was to wrap them in cosmic significance. In Maya cosmology, death was not an end but a transformation. The body was not discarded, it was prepared. Cinnabar became a second skin, a sacred garment for the soul. It infused the dead with symbolic blood, empowering their passage into Xibalba, the Maya underworld, and beyond. This was not a passive ritual. It was an alchemical act meant to elevate the dead to a divine state. But not everyone earned red. Among the elite tombs of Palenque, only 2 were found lined with cinnabar: the tomb of King Pakal and the mysterious woman we now call the Red Queen. This puts her in extraordinary company. It suggests not just royal status, but a spiritual elevation, someone seen as more than mortal. Queen, perhaps, or something even more sacred. Cinnabar's use wasn't symbolic alone. Came with a cost. Mercury, even in mineral form, is a neurotoxin. Inhaled, absorbed through the skin, or consumed, it causes tremors, hallucinations, organ failure, and eventually death. Modern researchers handle ancient cinnabar with masks and gloves. The Maya did not, but they did notice its effects. They may not have known the term neurotoxin, but they sensed its power. The dizziness, the altered states, the danger. It was understood not as poison, but as potency. Cinnabar was feared, revered, and never used casually. Its volatility was part of its mystique. To be buried in it was not just an honor, it was a declaration. This person walked the edge between life and divinity. Covering a corpse in cinnabar was not about preservation. It was about transformation. The red dust, so dense and brilliant it clung to the bones for centuries, turned the deceased into a relic, a presence, a legend. And there's more. Because of its toxicity, the cinnabar also created a barrier, an invisible wall that warned the living to keep their distance. Not just physically, but spiritually. To disturb such a tomb was not only to violate the dead. It was to invite madness, illness, and chaos. In this way, cinnabar protected the dead and warned the living. The tomb became untouchable, the body sacred, And so we return to the Red Queen. Her bones were soaked in cinnabar. Her mask was coated. The walls around her dusted in red. There was no moderation. This was not ceremonial excess, it was symbolic absolutism. Whoever she was, she had been given the full right. Not a courtly burial. Cosmic one. This level of treatment puts her on par with Pakel the Great. That is not an artistic decision. It's political. It's spiritual. It's deliberate. Cinnabar, in her case, wasn't a funerary detail. It was a second coronation. Her name may be lost, but her burial speaks for her. And it tells us, this was no ordinary woman. She was divine by blood, chosen by right, remembered not in writing, but in red. She had no name, no inscription, no recorded story. But her burial told a different truth. She had authority, she had sanctity, and she had power. When archaeologists opened the sealed tomb in Temple 13 and found the remains of a woman covered in red cinnabar and surrounded by royal offerings, they were not looking at an ordinary burial. The structure, untouched for more than 1,300 years, yielded something rare in Mesoamerican archaeology. A pristine mortuary context, clearly designed with intention, status, and sacred function. What they found was unmistakably elite. The body, identified through osteological analysis as female and aged between 50 and 60, lay in a carved stone sarcophagus. Around her were carefully arranged items: jade necklaces, earrings, and ornaments, carved bone pins, obsidian blades, and vessels sealed for the afterlife. Her face was covered with a mosaic jade mask. Each tile fitted precisely to the contours of the skull. The bones, the mask, the grave goods, all submerged beneath a dense coating of powdered cinnabar, the sacred red mineral associated with divine transition. This was not an anonymous death. This was a deliberate transformation. Yet the central mystery remains. Who was she? There are no inscriptions within the tomb. No glyphs carved onto the sarcophagus. No accompanying stele naming the occupant. In a civilization that documented lineage, status, and titles with rigorous consistency, this silence is striking. But it does not suggest insignificance. On the contrary, it implies a type of sanctity not tied to personal identity. In Maya cosmology, memory did not require words. It could be encoded in ritual, color, orientation, and proximity. Several hypotheses have emerged, some ruled out, others still debated. The most compelling possibility is that she was Tizi Akbu Ajah, the principal wife of King Kinich Janab Pakel, whose tomb lies just meters away in the Temple of the Inscriptions. The proximity between the two burial sites is not coincidental. In Maya temple planning, spatial placement carried meaning. The positioning of her tomb beside that of the king suggests a deliberate statement of alignment, ritual, dynastic, and cosmic. Moreover, Tizi Akbu Ajah bore multiple sons who later held high office, further strengthening the argument that she was more than consort, she was a dynastic anchor. A second theory once proposed Sakuk, Pakel's mother, and a ruling queen in her own right. She governed Palenque during Pakel's youth and issued royal edicts, held court, and shaped early political strategies. However, DNA testing has ruled out a maternal link between the remains and Pakel, effectively eliminating this possibility. A third possibility suggests she may have been a high-ranking priestess or ritual figure, perhaps one whose significance was spiritual rather than strictly political. This theory draws on the abstract nature of the burial, the absence of explicit name, the intensity of ritual symbolism, and the austere construction of the tomb, which lacks narrative inscriptions but is saturated with ceremonial markers. In Maya religion, priestesses held essential roles as intercessors between the human and divine. A tomb like this, stripped of historical context but full of sacred code, could point to such a person. Regardless of the precise identity, what is certain is her rank. Only one other individual in Palenque, King Pakel, was buried with such quantities of cinnabar and jade. The parallels between the two burials are deliberate. Both were placed in temples, both within stone sarcophagi, both interred with extreme ritual care. It is difficult to imagine this was done for any reason other than symbolic pairing. If Pakel represented the solar order, she may have embodied its counterpart, lunar, feminine, cyclical, and equally essential. Her anonymity is not a void. It is a choice. Whether forgotten or protected by silence, the woman we call the Red Queen was not buried as a subject. She was entombed as a sovereign. And while her name may never be recovered, her presence reshapes our understanding of Maya kingship, lineage, and the role of royal women. Her tomb does not recount her story in words, but it communicates something enduring. She was known, she was honored, and she was prepared for eternity, not as decoration to power, but as its equal. It wasn't just a burial site. It was a sacred diagram, carefully placed, intentionally sealed, and silently communicating everything the living weren't meant to say out loud. Temple 13, where the Red Queen was found, sits quietly beside the Grand Temple of the Inscriptions. Architecturally modest, almost overlooked, it doesn't boast the towering presence of its neighbor. But in Maya cosmology, visibility was never the full measure of power. What mattered was location, direction, purpose. And by that standard, Temple 13 is anything but random. Its proximity to Pakal the Great's pyramid, the most important mortuary monument in Palenque, signals something deliberate. This was not the resting place of a forgotten noblewoman. This was a chamber reserved for a presence that matched the king's, not in public memory, but in spiritual resonance. To reach the tomb, one must descend a narrow, steep staircase tucked deep inside the temple's core. There are no wide ceremonial ramps, no grand processions implied. The path downward is intimate, constricted, and solemn, more pilgrimage than entrance. This descent mirrors Maya beliefs about death, that it is a journey downward, inward into the underworld known as the Balba. In Maya myth, the underworld was not a single place, but a layered spiritual realm full of trials, transformations, and passageways. The architecture of Temple 13 echoes that. You don't arrive at the tomb. You arrive through it. And when you reach the bottom, there's no inscription waiting. No glyphic panel proclaims the deeds or name of the interred. No narrative stone carvings decorate the chamber. There is only silence. Stone walls, still and bare. But in Maya funerary architecture, absence is rarely emptiness. Here, the silence is loaded. What the tomb does not say with words, it states through design, color, and alignment. The cinnabar speaks. The jade speaks. The sealed structure, the hidden stairway, the precise orientation, all of them speak. Unlike Pakal's tomb, which proclaims cosmic rebirth in intricate carvings, the Red Queen's tomb operates like a private ritual space. A chamber not meant to declare, but to transfigure. The choice to leave the walls unmarked may reflect a sacred privacy, a spiritual secrecy, or even an intention to lift the deceased beyond the reach of ordinary history. It's not that her story wasn't told. It's that it was never meant to be told in stone. Only in gesture, in ritual, and in the architecture of the dead. Then there's the proximity. Her tomb lies just meters away from that of Pakal the Great. In a city where temple layout reflected cosmic order, that closeness is charged with meaning. The Maya structured their sacred sites like living cosmograms. Temples aligned to stars, seasons, cardinal directions, and to each other. Burials were part of that order. To be buried beside the Sun King was to be part of his orbit, not just biologically, but cosmologically. And in that symbolism, a duality emerges. Pakal, often associated with the sun in artistic and cosmological terms, is the active force, life-giving, seen, central. The Red Queen, buried in a quieter structure, shrouded in cinnabar and darkness, becomes his complement, the lunar force, reflective, cyclical, regenerative. Together, their placements suggest more than intimacy. They suggest balance. Male and female. Solar and lunar. Day and night. Authority and ritual. She is not below him, nor behind. She is beside. This dual tomb placement may even echo a metaphysical relationship. In Maya belief, kings and queens were not only political figures but cosmic ones. Their deaths required spatial choreography. Their bodies became part of the terrain of belief. The tombs themselves weren't merely containers for remains. They were instruments in a sacred grammar, forming sentences of meaning only the initiated could fully read. And so Temple 13, while modest in height, becomes towering in implication. Its hidden tomb is not an accident of preservation, but an act of spiritual engineering. The Red Queen's final resting place is an architectural invocation, a silent ceremony that still speaks across centuries. No inscription spoke her name, but the objects buried with her whispered things far more enduring, stories of identity, divinity, and the long journey beyond death. The tomb of the Red Queen was not cluttered. It was calibrated. Each item placed beside her remains was there for a reason: ritual, protection, recognition. In Maya belief, the dead did not simply vanish. They journeyed. And that journey required tools, not luxuries. What was buried with her was not treasure. It was instruction. A spiritual map made of mineral, bone, and silence. At the center was the mask, carved from dozens of polished jade fragments carefully shaped to follow the lines of her face. The Red Queen's death mask was more than a funerary ornament. In Maya cosmology, jade was sacred not for its rarity, but for its meaning. It symbolized life force, eternity, divine breath. Wearing jade into the afterlife wasn't vanity. It was metaphysics. The mask was a vessel, a safeguard, a means of recognition in the world of spirits. Without a name carved in stone, this was how her soul would remember itself. Wrapped around her neck and resting on her arms were more pieces of jade, necklaces, earrings, beads of exquisite craft. Not showy, but deliberate. These were markers of status, yes, but more than that, they were offerings to the gods and companions in the void. In Maya theology, jade connected the earthly and divine. It was believed to hold the breath of creation, and only the most sacred bodies were given the right to be draped in it. The Red Queen was one of them. The green glow of jade at her throat wasn't decorative. It was consecrated. Scattered near her bones were bone needles, slender, sharpened, ceremonial. These tools may have once pierced flesh in rituals of auto-sacrifice, drawing blood to nourish the gods. Or they may have symbolized her own role in spiritual leadership, not just a queen, but a priestess, a conduit. In Maya courts, royal women performed sacred rites, bloodlettings, and dream work. If the Red Queen had done the same, these bone implements were extensions of that spiritual authority buried to empower her soul beyond death. Closed by lay blades of obsidian, black volcanic glass, sharp as memory. Obsidian was not just a tool. It was revered for its reflective, almost mystical properties. These blades were likely used in ceremonies to open pathways between realms to sever the mundane from the sacred. Their presence in her tomb was not protective in a physical sense, it was spiritual defense. Symbols of readiness, of passage, of transformation. Then came the sealed ceramic vessels placed along the walls of her burial chamber. Some may have once held cacao or pulque, traditional offerings for the journey into the underworld. Others may have contained incense, sacred plants, or even ashes of creatures considered spirit guides. Their seals, still intact after centuries, suggest a ritual closure and act of finality. These jars were not discarded. They were appointed. Their contents were less about sustenance and more about continuity. Fuel for the journey through Xibalba, the Maya underworld. What stands out is what's missing. No gold. No gem-studded thrones. No chariots for the dead. This was not a burial designed to impress the living. It was built to equip the soul. The restraint is striking. The focus is ritual. Every object bears weight. Every placement holds purpose. Together, they form a silent text, unwritten but unmistakable. A theology of presence encoded in mineral and craft. This was a queen not of display, but of depth. Her wealth was not measured in coin, but in meaning. Each item beside her was a syllable in a larger prayer, a piece of choreography in her sacred transition. The grave goods were not decoration. They were declaration. The Red Queen's tomb tells no story in glyphs. But through jade and obsidian, through cinnabar and sealed clay, she tells us what mattered, not how she lived, but how she was meant to be remembered. Her name was never carved into stone. But the way she was buried spoke louder than any inscription. This was not just a woman. This was a force. In many ancient civilizations, women are footnotes supporting characters in a narrative written by men. But not here. Not in Palenque. Not in the world the Red Queen came from. The Maya did not erase their women. They remembered them in temples, inscribed them in ritual, and sometimes buried them like gods. The Maya world was deeply cosmological. Every role, every object, every gesture had meaning. And within that layered universe, women occupied space not just in the home, but in the palace, the temple, and the sacred calendar. They were rulers, regents, priestesses, and diplomats. They carried bloodlines. They carried kingdoms. And in rare cases, like the Red Queen, they carried both political authority and spiritual gravity. Consider Sakuk, the mother of Pakal the Great. When Palenque stood at a political crossroads, it was she who took the throne. Not as a placeholder, not as a silent guardian, but as a ruling monarch, issuing edicts, commissioning temples, and stabilizing the kingdom until her son could inherit it. In Maya terms, she wasn't a queen mother. She was a queen. The Red Queen may have followed in those footsteps. She was not buried as a consort. She was interred like a sovereign. Her tomb mirrored that of Pakal, red dust, jade mask, sealed stone. Her resting place was not an annex. It was an axis. She lay adjacent to the king, not below him. And in Maya symbolism, adjacency matters. To lie beside the sun is to be the moon. To be buried in cinnabar is to bleed into eternity. The Red Queen may have held no title on her sarcophagus. But her death rites told a different story. Her jewelry spoke of dynasty. Her ritual tools hinted at priesthood. Her mask suggested that she was not just crossing into the next world, she was expected there. She may have been a queen. She may have been a priestess. She may have been both. But what makes her most powerful is not what we can prove. It's what her tomb refuses to explain. Her identity is elusive. Her biography erased. And that erasure itself feels intentional. In my belief, identity was not always fixed to a name. It could be bound to symbol, ritual, and role. To remove the name is to elevate the essence. The Red Queen became more than a person. She became a presence. Her burial site suggests not just a role in life, but a function in death. She was positioned not to disappear, but to intercede, to exist between the human and the divine, between breath and stone. The cinnabar that coated her wasn't just decoration, it was consecration. A ritual skin to transform a mortal body into something eternal. And beside her always is Pakal, the king and the Red Queen, sun and moon. His temple was public, inscribed, monumental. Hers was quieter, inward, sealed in silence. But together they form a pair, a celestial dyad, a cosmic symmetry. In the Maya worldview, duality is not opposition. It is completion. Light needs shadow. Sky needs earth. Male needs female, not in submission, but in balance. The tombs of Pakal and the Red Queen reflect that balance. His death was a declaration. Hers, a devotion. Together, they frame the universe as the Maya saw it, ordered, cyclical, and sacred. The Red Queen forces us to rethink what power looked like in the past. She wasn't a consort. She was a cornerstone. She wasn't remembered by her name. She was remembered by her presence. And that presence still pulses through the jade, the cinnabar, the silence. She may have ruled in life, but in death, she reigns as a symbol of feminine power, of sacred transformation, and of a world where women shaped not only dynasties, but destiny. She left behind no written name, no carved glyphs, no titles etched into stone. And yet, what she left is impossible to forget. The Red Queen speaks through what remains, through the cinnabar that clings to bone like breath held too long, through the jade that rests against her face like a second skin. Her story is not silent. It simply uses a different language. When the archaeologists opened her tomb in 1994, they didn't just discover a burial. They uncovered a message carefully composed without words. Everything about her resting place was chosen, its proximity to Pakal's grand tomb, the depth at which she was buried, the absence of inscriptions, the precision of the cinnabar dust. It was as if someone had decided long ago her name didn't need to be preserved because her presence would be. Her burial was not an act of concealment. It was an act of transformation. In the Maya worldview, death is not disappearance. It is movement, a crossing over, not into nothing, but into something else. For a person to be buried with cinnabar was not just a privilege. It was a declaration. This was someone being prepared for something beyond human life. A journey, a return, a continuation. She was placed beside Pakal the Great, the most revered ruler of Palenque. Not as an afterthought, not hidden away, but in deliberate proximity. That closeness is a form of communication. Maya architecture was intentional, alignments, direction, and spatial relationships carried meaning. To bury her there was to say that she was central. Not just to someone's life, but to the cosmic order they believed in. We may never know her name, but that may be the point. Some figures are remembered not for who they were, but for what they embodied. The Red Queen is not a single identity. She is the embodiment of the sacred feminine in Maya power structures, the priestess, the queen, the mother, the one who holds the cycles together. She does not stand behind the king. She stands beside him. She complements the sun with the moon, the fire of command with the quiet persistence of ritual. Her grave was modest in its materials, no gold, no opulence. And yet, it carries more weight than many royal tombs. Every object buried with her had purpose. Every shard of jade, every sealed ceramic vessel, every obsidian blade was selected with the belief that the spirit survives and travels and needs protection and power in that next world. She was equipped not for display, but for passage. In the absence of a name, she forces us to ask different questions. Who is remembered and why? Is history only about those who left records, or is it also shaped by those whose stories are preserved through care, through reverence, through the choices made by others long after their deaths? The Red Queen reminds us that memory does not always need language. Sometimes ritual is enough. Sometimes presence is louder than proclamation. She exists now in a space between archaeology and myth. A real woman with real bones whose burial tells us that she mattered deeply. And a symbol reshaped over time that tells us women in ancient Maya society were not passive. They were spiritual anchors. They were political players. They were remembered, if not by name, then by gesture, by placement, by the layers of red dust that still coat the stone. She was not erased. She was elevated. And though she remains unnamed, the Red Queen is not lost to time. She is part of how we understand a civilization that saw no boundary between ritual and rule, between body and cosmos, between death and continuity. She is not silent. She never was. We simply had to learn how to listen. Under the scorching skies of early 20th century Coyoacán, then just a small village on the outskirts of Mexico City, a girl was born on July 6, 1907. Her name was Frida Kahlo. The house she was born into, Casa Azul, the blue house, was no ordinary home. With cobalt blue walls, yellow trim, and a lush garden, it was a place bursting with color, contradiction, and a quiet strength. This house would hold her beginnings, her agony, her art, and eventually her death. And in between, it would witness the making of a legend. Frida was born into a world of dualities. Her father, Guillermo Kahlo, was a German-Jewish photographer with a keen eye for structure, detail, and symmetry. Her mother, Matilda Calderon, was of mixed indigenous and Spanish descent, devoutly Catholic, emotionally distant, and rooted in Mexican tradition. These two halves, European and indigenous, intellectual and spiritual, measured and mythic, collided within Frida. She didn't just inherit her father's talent and her mother's resilience. She inherited their contradictions and made them into her canvas. At the age of 6, Frida contracted polio, a disease that left her bedridden for months and permanently damaged her right leg. Her foot and leg became thinner, weaker, causing a limp that never left her. Children teased her, and the shame of physical difference settled in early. She often wore long skirts to hide her leg, but she never let it define her spirit. Instead, isolation pushed her inward. She read voraciously. She imagined fiercely. She learned to live in her mind and eventually in her art. Her father became her closest ally. While other girls were learning embroidery, Frida learned about photography, lighting, and perspective. Guillermo encouraged her to move, to paint, to stay mentally alert. From him, she absorbed not only technique, but the patience of an observer, the gift of seeing deeply and saying little. Art was not yet her path, but the seeds were quietly sown. Frida's earliest dream was not to become a painter, it was to become a doctor. She was determined to heal others, perhaps because she knew what it felt like to be broken. At 15, she was accepted into the National Preparatory School, one of Mexico's most prestigious institutions and one rarely open to young women at the time. Among hundreds of male students, Frida stood out. She wasn't just brilliant, she was sharp-tongued, rebellious, and wildly curious. She joined a group of radical intellectuals called Los Cachiches who debated philosophy, politics, and poetry. Frida was drawn to revolution, to ideas that broke rules and reimagined power. Even then, before the accident that would shatter her spine and reshape her fate, Frida was already sketching herself into the world with sharp lines, bold thought, and a selfhood too unruly for anyone else's expectations. Her childhood was not soft. It was colored by illness, sharpened by intellect, and defined by difference. But it was from this mixture, this wild blend of culture, pain, and defiance, that the voice of Frida Kahlo began to rise. A girl born in blue walls with mismatched legs and unmatched will was already preparing not just to survive, but to transform everything she touched. On the afternoon of September 17, 1925, Frida Kahlo boarded a wooden bus with her then-boyfriend, Alejandro Gomez Arias. She was 18, bright, rebellious, brilliant, and had just left school. The two joked, flirted, perhaps argued, as young lovers do. The sun was low. The ride should have been routine. It wasn't. Moments later, an electric streetcar slammed into the side of the bus with such force that the vehicle was ripped apart like paper. Wood splintered. Metal tore through bodies. And in the middle of that violence, time broke. Frida was thrown. A handrail pierced her lower abdomen and exited through her pelvis, cutting her in half without killing her. Her spine fractured in 3 places. Her pelvis was shattered. Her collarbone broke. Her right leg snapped like a twig in 11 places. Her foot was crushed. Her shoulder dislocated. Her ribs collapsed inward. She lost blood so quickly, people thought she was dead. Someone covered her body with a borrowed coat. Another person noticed something strange, her skin sparkled. Not with sweat or blood, but with gold dust, the pigment from the paint she had carried in her satchel. At the moment of impact, the tin had burst open, coating her broken body with something luminous, surreal, unforgettable. Frida Kahlo had just survived the accident that would divide her life into 2 halves, before and after. And in that sparkling moment of agony, a legend was born. She was rushed to the hospital, unconscious, barely breathing. The days that followed were a blur of morphine, surgeries, clamps, and silence. Her body was confined in a full-body cast, her mind trapped in immobility. She could no longer sit, could no longer walk, could no longer escape her own pain. And yet, from this prison of plaster and bone, something began to stir. Her mother, a stern woman not known for sentimentality, built her a custom-made easel, one that could rest on her bed. She hung a mirror above Frida's head so she could look at herself without moving. And in that suspended state, Frida began to paint. At first, it was out of boredom. But quickly, the brush became something else, a scalpel, a tool of resistance, a whisper from her deepest places. She painted herself because she was the only subject available. But the images were not decorative. They were dissection tables. Her canvases showed a woman split open, pinned together, bleeding, staring back with steady eyes. What had begun as a career in medicine was now transformed. Her body, once meant to heal others, had become her greatest teacher. She would no longer study anatomy to cure illness. She would paint the wounds she carried, again and again, as both witness and survivor. Frida once said, "The accident and painting saved me." She meant it. Art didn't erase her pain. It translated it. It gave her a way to stay alive without pretending to be whole. Her injuries forced her to leave the world of science, but in doing so, she entered a world even more intimate. The internal landscape of her own suffering turned sacred through brush and color. She did not choose painting as a calling. It claimed her. In the quiet of convalescence, as bones mended crookedly and infections flared, a new kind of vision was born. One that saw beauty in pain. One that never looked away from the broken body. One that made vulnerability into language. Frida Kahlo did not become a painter because she wanted to. She became one because she had to. Because death had knocked. And she answered not with surrender, but with art. Frida Kahlo never set out to become an artist. She did not walk into an art academy, sign her name in ink, and declare her ambitions. Art for her was not a decision, it was a consequence. A consequence of pain, of stillness, of being shattered and left to rebuild one stroke at a time. She never studied art formally. She was never a student of technique in the traditional sense. Her classroom was a hospital bed. Her professors were silence, mirrors, and agony. Her first subjects were not landscapes or still lives. They were her own eyes, her own broken spine, her own body locked in plaster. Painting began not as a pursuit, but as survival. As a whisper back to the universe that had tried to silence her. Those early paintings were intimate and raw. Small in size, but overwhelming in depth. They weren't decorative. They weren't meant to please. They were records, fragments of a body and spirit pieced back together through sheer will. As her recovery progressed, so did her language. Her canvases grew more ambitious, more symbolic, more confrontational. Frida developed a style that was never easy to categorize because it did not imitate, it originated. Though often called a surrealist, Frida rejected the label. "I never paint dreams," she said. "I paint my own reality." Her art was not about escaping the world, it was about diving deeper into it. Into the gut of it. Her reality was filled with blood, thorns, skeletons, corsets, unborn children, and gazes that never flinched. Paintings like The Broken Column or Henry Ford Hospital were not metaphors. They were exacting visual autopsies of what it meant to live inside a body that refused to heal, in a mind that refused to be silent. Her subjects were relentless and recurring. Herself. Her pain. Her body. Her love. Her Mexico. Over a third of her works were self-portraits, not because of vanity, but because she knew herself best. And she needed to tell the truth. About the 29 surgeries. About the miscarriages. About Diego's betrayals. About the isolation that comes not just from illness, but from being a woman in a world that demands your silence. In Henry Ford Hospital, she floats on a blood-soaked bed surrounded by symbols of grief, an anatomical model, a fetus, a snail, a fractured pelvis. She is naked. She is weeping. But she is also looking. Always looking. She refuses to look away. That's what makes her work unbearable and unforgettable. Frida's paintings are not just about physical pain. They're about how that pain reshapes identity. Her art is a dialogue with the female body, not as something to be desired, but as something to be survived. She painted menstruation, abortion, infidelity, depression. And she did so without flinching, without apology, without asking permission. Her work is political, not in slogans, but in scars. She painted Mexico too, but not the postcard version. Her canvases were rich with folk motifs, pre-Columbian gods, Aztec icons, and Catholic altars all layered with blood and flowers. She wore Tehuana dresses and flower crowns not as fashion but as cultural armor. Her heritage wasn't background, it was foreground. Frida didn't just paint like a Mexican. She painted as Mexico itself, defiant, colorful, scarred, beautiful. More than anything, Frida's work is a confrontation. With herself. With the viewer. With history. Her painting was her protest against pain, against patriarchy, against disappearance. "I paint myself because I am so often alone," she once said. "And because I am the subject I know best." But she also painted herself because no one else could. Because her story, her rage, her tenderness, her complexity, none of it fit neatly into frames hung by others. Frida Kahlo didn't make art to be admired. She made it to survive. Each painting is a wound she chose to expose, not for pity, but for power. Her canvases are not windows. They are mirrors. And in them we see what happens when a woman takes back her narrative, not by erasing her scars, but by illuminating them. Her art was never just art. It was resistance in oil and color. It was breath. It was battle. And it was hers. All hers. When Frida Kahlo met Diego Rivera in 1928, it wasn't just the meeting of two artists, it was the collision of two storms. She was 21, bold, and still recovering from the accident that had nearly killed her. He was 41, a national icon already regarded as one of Mexico's greatest painters, known for his grand murals, his radical politics, and his unapologetic appetite for life, food, fame, and women. Frida brought her paintings to him, not to flatter, but to ask one searing question: "Do you think I have talent?" Diego looked, paused, and replied, "Yes. And not just because I'm kind." That single moment sparked a connection that would define, consume, and reshape both their lives. They married the following year, in 1929. For Frida's family, it was an odd pairing, a towering man with a reputation for womanizing and a young woman already marked by pain. Her father famously called it the marriage of an elephant and a dove. But this was no fairy tale. Their union was rooted in mutual admiration, shared politics, and a profound devotion to Mexican identity. Yet from the start, it was also a powder keg. Frida and Diego were both larger than life, passionate, idealistic, and fiercely independent. But they were also deeply flawed. Diego couldn't remain faithful. He had countless affairs, including a devastating betrayal with Frida's own younger sister, Cristina. For Frida, this was a wound deeper than most of her physical scars. It shattered something inside her, leading to a spiral of rage, sorrow, and transformation. In response, Frida sought liberation on her own terms. She had affairs with both men and women, relationships that were not just reactions, but declarations. With revolutionary Leon Trotsky, she explored political intimacy. With painter Georgia O'Keeffe, she explored something softer, more sensual. Her lovers were often artists, thinkers, exiles. She wasn't hiding. She was expanding. Through love and sex, she tested boundaries and reclaimed her body as her own, no longer defined solely by pain or by Diego. In 1939, they divorced. It was a rupture that felt final. Frida painted the two Fridas shortly after, an image of two selves holding hands, one bleeding, the other composed. It was a portrait of grief and duality. But just 1 year later, they remarried. This time, Frida laid out conditions. She would keep her name. She would keep her money. They would live in separate houses connected only by a footbridge. She was married again, but never owned again. Their love was never peaceful, but it was powerful. Diego was a betrayal and a muse, a wound and a well. Frida once said, "I've suffered two great accidents in my life. One was the tram. The other was Diego. Diego was the worst. And yet he was also her mirror, her enemy, her collaborator, her contradiction." Their connection was brutal, but it was also real. In the years they spent together, Frida's art deepened. Diego never tried to change her work, he encouraged it, championed it. And though he broke her heart repeatedly, he also took her seriously. As a painter, as a mind, as a woman who refused to be quiet. He heard her, but he also saw her. And in return, she transformed that pain into canvas. Frida Kahlo did not just survive Diego Rivera, she transmuted him into color, shape, and story. He became both subject and catalyst, the chaos from which her most haunting, intimate works would emerge. Their love wasn't romantic. It was volcanic. And from its ash, Frida built her most unforgettable fire. When Frida Kahlo followed Diego Rivera to the United States in the early 1930s, she stepped into a new world, not just geographically, but ideologically. While Diego was celebrated as a muralist, commissioned by wealthy patrons and American institutions, Frida entered as a quiet observer. From San Francisco to Detroit to New York, she stood behind him in photographs, but in private, she was taking notes. She saw opulence, machinery, steel, but she also saw something missing. They have everything, she wrote to a friend, except soul. While Diego was painting walls the size of cities, Frida was unraveling what it meant to exist within one. In Detroit, she suffered a miscarriage, a loss that became the centerpiece of her painting Henry Ford Hospital, a raw, unflinching portrait of blood, despair, and anatomy. It was unlike anything anyone in America was painting. While the outside world praised progress, Frida painted pain. Not abstract, not decorative, personal, physical, political. Her body was the canvas. Her blood, the pigment. Her truth, unavoidable. The wealth, the superficiality, the glaring contrast between rich and poor, none of it impressed her. She mocked the American elite in letters home, finding them obsessed with comfort and appearances, blind to suffering. She craved the dirt, the contradictions, and the soulfulness of Mexico. America was clean. Too clean. And Frida didn't trust clean things. In her bones, she missed the chaos, the color, the honest imperfection of her own country. When she finally returned to Mexico, it was not as the same woman who had left. She returned sharper, fiercer, more herself. The Frida who came back was unapologetically adorned in Tehuana dresses, rebozos, and woven flowers, symbols of indigenous strength, not mere fashion. Her art became a declaration of rootedness. In her work, myth met blood. Aztec gods whispered behind her self-portraits. Cornfields, monkeys, skeletons, and veins stretched across canvases like ancient scripts rewritten in a modern hand. Mexico wasn't just her home. It was her defiance. In 1939, her paintings reached Paris. André Breton, leader of the Surrealist movement, invited her to exhibit. Her piece The Frame became the first Mexican artwork acquired by the Louvre. She was praised by the likes of Picasso, Kandinsky, and Breton himself. They tried to claim her, label her, frame her within their theories of the dreamlike and subconscious. But Frida pushed back. They think I'm a surrealist, she said. But I'm not. I don't paint dreams. I paint my own reality. To Frida, art wasn't a mystical escape. It was a scalpel. It cut deep. It revealed what doctors couldn't fix and what husbands couldn't soothe. It was her confrontation with pain, with politics, with the mirror. Her time in the US and France exposed her to global acclaim but never swayed her convictions. While others saw Europe and America as artistic meccas, Frida saw places where truth was often disguised by fashion and theory. She didn't want to escape into style. She wanted to tell stories raw, red, rooted. This chapter of her life marked a global turning point. The world started to see Frida. But more importantly, Frida saw the world and chose, defiantly, to remain herself. Her voice didn't shift. Her palette didn't fade. Her message didn't soften. She didn't leave Mexico behind. She carried it into every gallery, every canvas, every uncomfortable truth. And even when she stood beneath the lights of Paris, she painted with the dust of Coyoacan on her hands. By the 1940s, the body Frida Kahlo had fought for so long was beginning to give in. Slowly, painfully, and with every collapse of flesh and bone, her spirit rose stronger. The aftermath of her catastrophic bus accident, decades behind her, was still very much inside her. It had never left. Over the years, she had endured more than 30 surgeries. Metal rods, spinal fusions, failed grafts, bone infections, and endless nights of burning pain. Her spine had become a battlefield and every inch of her frame was scarred from combat. Her health declined with a cruel rhythm. Days of bed rest turned into weeks, then months. Sleep became fractured. Infections became chronic. In 1953, her doctors gave her the news that felt like a final betrayal. Her right leg, already weak from polio and surgeries, had developed gangrene. It had to be amputated from the knee down. That loss sent her into a storm of despair. She wrote in her diary, not with self-pity, but with poetry, "Feet, what do I need you for when I have wings to fly?" But even then, especially then, Frida didn't retreat from life. She retreated into art. From her bed, surrounded by mirrors, canvases, brushes taped to sticks, and trays of paint, she created. She painted not with distance, but with proximity to death. Her works in these years pulsed with darkness, but not defeat. They spoke of resistance, of survival, not just as endurance, but as protest. Her images became rawer, more symbolic, soaked in blood, politics, and sacred pain. The body broken, bound, crucified, but always watching. Always conscious. Always fighting back. In 1953, something monumental happened. Frida, after years of being overshadowed by Diego, was finally given her first solo exhibition in Mexico. The show was hosted by Lola Alvarez Bravo, a fellow female artist and a pioneer in her own right. But by that point, Frida could barely sit up. Her doctors forbade her from attending. Her body said no. But Frida said yes. She called for an ambulance. She was carried into the gallery on a stretcher laid in the center of the room like a painting herself. Draped in embroidered Tewana dress, flowers in her hair, a smile defying the morphine coursing through her veins, Frida welcomed her guests from a hospital bed. She drank tequila. She sang. She laughed. She became the art, the altar, and the fire all at once. That moment wasn't a performance. It was a declaration, I am still here. And then the final painting. Shortly before her death in 1954, Frida completed a still life. Not of suffering, not of fractured bones or bleeding hearts, but of watermelon. Red, ripe, joyful slices of life. The painting was called Viva la Vida. Long live life, she inscribed in careful letters across a bright slice. It was the last thing she painted. And perhaps the truest. Because even at the edge of death, Frida did not whisper. She roared color. She did not retreat into bitterness. She carved gratitude into fruit. She chose to leave the world not with a whimper, but with paint under her nails and a phrase that still echoes, Viva la Vida. She passed away on July 13, 1954, at the Blue House in Coyoacán, the same home where she was born. The official cause was a pulmonary embolism, but those who knew her spoke of something deeper. She was tired. Tired of pain. Tired of surgeries. Tired of the war her body waged against her. A few days before her death, she had attended a protest against U.S. interference in Guatemala, her fist raised from a wheelchair. Revolution even in her last breath. Her final diary entry was hauntingly simple. I hope the departure is joyful and I hope never to return. Frida Kahlo did not leave quietly. Her funeral was held at the Palacio de Bellas Arts, Mexico's most revered cultural institution. Her coffin was draped in the red flag of the Communist Party. Friends, lovers, artists, and revolutionaries came to honor her, not just as a painter, but as a force. Diego Rivera stood over her casket, shattered. He called her the love of his life. A woman he had wounded, but who had loved him with more ferocity than he ever deserved. But Frida's greatest love was life itself. Not the soft, romantic kind, but the wild, bleeding, defiant kind. She painted through agony. She danced on one leg. She sang from a hospital bed. She left behind no apologies, only fire. In her final years, she became a myth, but not one made of fantasy. She was real. Too real. And that's what made her eternal. Because Frida Kahlo didn't just survive pain. She made it sacred. Frida Kahlo died on July 13, 1954. She was 47 years old. The official cause was a pulmonary embolism, but those closest to her believed it wasn't just her lungs that gave out, it was a soul exhausted from decades of fighting. Fighting pain. Fighting betrayal. Fighting the world's expectations and her own broken body. A few days earlier, she had marched in protest against the CIA-backed coup in Guatemala. In a wheelchair. Her fist raised. Her eyes sharp as ever. Revolution still burning in her breath. Her final diary entry was only one line. It read, I hope the exit is joyful and I hope never to return. Words soft in phrasing, yet thunderous in finality. Some whispered of suicide. Others chose not to speak it aloud. What remained beyond dispute was that her departure, like her life, carried the weight of poetry, the beauty of defiance, and the silence of something sacred. She died in the Blue House, the same place where she was born, where she had painted, where she had loved, and where she had suffered over and over again. Her ashes rest there still. Not hidden away, but held in a pre-Columbian urn shaped like a toad, Diego's nickname for her. But Frida did not vanish. She left behind nearly 200 works of art. Portraits. Still lives. Dreamscapes soaked in blood, bone, and truth. Her paintings were never decorative. They were declarations. Every canvas held her body. Every brushstroke a pulse. She painted the unbearable, miscarriage, disfigurement, loneliness, sexual longing, ideological passion. But she never asked for pity. She demanded presence. Frida Kahlo turned personal pain into something universal. She painted not to escape, but to witness. To mark the page with survival. With rebellion. With soul. Today, her face is everywhere, plastered on t-shirts, murals, phone cases, gallery walls. The monobrow, the crown of flowers, the unflinching stare. She has become a global icon, but not just for her art. For what she dared to be. She is a symbol of feminist power, a woman who didn't apologize for her strength or her vulnerability. A queer icon, fearless in her fluidity and desires. A champion of disability, someone who created through agony, who made the hospital bed into a studio. A voice of Mexican identity, one who draped herself in Tewana dresses, who painted maize and blood and Aztec myth not for fashion, but for truth. Frida didn't try to be perfect. She was never neat. She was honest, raw, complicated. Her life was not a clean arc, it was jagged, fractured, stitched together with color and pain. And in that, people saw themselves, especially those who had never seen themselves in art before. The Blue House, La Casa Azul, is now a museum. In Coyoacan, it holds her original paintings, her corsets, her canes, her jewelry, her notebooks. Her bed still there. The mirror on the canopy unchanged. You walk through its cobalt blue halls and feel her everywhere, not just in the objects, but in the air. Frida Kahlo did not disappear in death. She expanded. She left not just paintings, but a challenge. A mirror. A manifesto. Dare to feel. Dare to speak. Dare to live out loud. In the end, she did not fade, she became eternal. Not because she was flawless, but because she was fire. Frida Kahlo was a painter, but that title no longer holds the weight of who she became. Over time, her work, her face, her defiance crossed beyond the world of art. She stepped out of the canvas and into the world's imagination. She lived with pain, but she didn't let it define her. She loved with contradictions, but didn't hide them. She dressed in tradition, not to conform, but to carry her roots. She became a figure people saw themselves in, not because she tried to represent anyone, but because she refused to represent anyone but herself. Frida lived in opposition. Against the norms of gender. Against ideals of beauty. Against expectations of what a woman should do, say, or look like. She didn't soften her edges for acceptance. Her brows remained untouched. Her mustache, visible. Her clothing, deliberate. Not costume. Statement. Not nostalgia. Identity. She loved men. She loved women. She loved fiercely, openly, even when it was dangerous to do so. This wasn't rebellion for show, it was how she existed. She didn't ask for approval. She didn't apologize. She also didn't separate her art from her beliefs. Her Mexico was not abstract. It was layered blood, myth, revolution, earth. Her paintings weren't trying to escape into fantasy. They dug into memory, heritage, and the everyday lives of people forgotten by official history. She didn't stylize Mexico. She presented it unvarnished, chaotic, beautiful, wounded, real. That honesty carried her image far. Today, her face is everywhere. Posters, murals, t-shirts, magazine covers. The flower crown, the heavy stare, the joined brows. She's been painted, sculpted, copied, parroted, sold. She became visible not because the art world wanted her. For decades after her death, she was largely ignored by institutions. But communities, women, queer people, Mexicans, artists outside the mainstream held onto her. They recognized something familiar. Someone who had lived through damage. Someone who refused to vanish. And as her visibility grew, so did the tension. Frida rejected capitalism. Yet now her likeness sells lipstick and luxury handbags. There is a Frida Kahlo Barbie doll. Her face is printed on coffee mugs. Her legacy is now a product. It raises questions. What does it mean to honor someone who spent her life challenging systems of power by placing her image inside those same systems? Is it tribute or is it consumption? Some dismiss this as inevitable. Others see it as betrayal. But what's certain is this, despite the commercialization, the core of what Frida stood for hasn't disappeared. Because her story isn't built on perfection. It's built on fracture. She offered no solutions. She didn't claim healing was neat. She gave no promises. But she showed what it looks like to live honestly inside a damaged body. She painted what others were taught to hide: illness, rage, loss, longing, and gave it color, shape, and name. Her presence today can feel split. A global icon, but also a deeply personal one. A symbol on tote bags, yes, but also someone who still speaks, in private, to those who have felt broken, unseen, or out of place. Frida's work wasn't tidy. Neither is her legacy. But that's exactly why it continues to move. She left behind no grand theory. Just a record of being human in a body that hurt, in a world that judged, in a life that burned through every disguise. And if she remains, it's not because of what she wore or how she looked. It's because she never stopped showing up exactly as she was.